Welcome. Welcoming all the alumni and hoping that we can share a message related to Pesach. What is freedom? What does freedom mean? What does it mean to be a free man? So certainly in the world at large, freedom is not to be under the rule of man, to be free to do what you want, to speak when you want, and to live a free life. The Torah would not be against this idea, but it seems to be there are different dimensions to freedom, different aspects, different layers that we have to uncover, maybe in addition to this idea. Let's start with a question. Following question. We are celebrating our liberation. We're celebrating our freedom on Pesach. Why then are we eating matzah? Matzah, the Haggadah says, is lechem oni, halachma anya, poor man's bread. Why, at a time of freedom, are we eating bread which is related to a poor person? One would think we'd be having a feast, we'd be eating the fanciest bread. Why are we eating a poor man's bread during the time of freedom? So the Maharal, to answer this question, says a fascinating idea. The Maharal says that to a certain degree, in a certain aspect, a poor man has a certain liberation that a rich man doesn't have. The rich man, because of all of his possessions, and because of all his big home, and his maybe have more than one home, and his cars, and everything, he has to worry about his possessions. He's tied to the physical world to a certain degree. A poor man, again, as long as he's not out begging, a poor man that really has nothing, he's not tied down to the physical world at all, but rather he is free to concentrate on what's important in life, which is spiritual, his connection with Hashem, and his spiritual pursuits. So to a certain degree, the poor man has a certain level of liberation that the rich man doesn't even have. And so therefore the Maharal says, Dafka, exactly at this time, we should be eating matzah, and it's a different view perhaps on what liberation is. What the Maharal is saying, liberation has to do with a spiritual liberation, liberating ourselves from the animal, from the physical, and therefore the matzah fits in. We could even say just observing matzah. I mean, I know matzah today is extremely expensive, but matzah is a less gashmiastic bread. It doesn't have expansion. It's more simple. It's a more ruchnius type of bread that we're eating. And if the goal of liberation is not just to be free from the rules of man, but to liberate ourselves spiritually and connect to the spiritual, well, matzah is the most appropriate type of food that we should be eating. Point number 2, and this is an interesting pattern that we find by liberation. If we're talking about freedom, we're talking about liberation. Another point. It seems to be, if you follow the history of the Jewish people, that there has to be a spiritual liberation first, and then we see a physical liberation which follows. And the source of that is Pesach. There had to be a release from the Egyptian mentality, from the slave mentality, and only then they were able to leave Egypt. Only then they were able to leave Mitzrayim. There had to be 10 plagues, and each of the plagues helped the Jews see the hand of Hashem, the love of Hashem, the hashgacha over the Jewish people. Once they went through the 10 plagues, culminating with Makas Bechoros, then they were able to leave. The spiritual liberation, following the theme of what we're saying, the spiritual liberation has to precede the physical liberation. We find the same thing happening by Klal Yisrael when they're wandering through the Midbar. The Mefarshim, the Sfarim HaKadoshim say that wandering through the Midbar was a purification of Klal Yisrael. Those 40 years of wandering was a purification of Klal Yisrael, working out the impurities of what we received in Mitzrayim and from our forefathers doing Avodah Zarah. Those 40 years was a purification process. Once we went through that process, then we could enter Eretz Yisrael. Then we could enter into our homeland and build the Mishkan. And even you could say that a midbar as well. A midbar is a place without Gashmias. It doesn't have the Gashmias of a more settled area. So we had to go through that spiritual liberation, then we could be physically liberated and come into our homeland. We find the same thing by the Maccabees, by the Chashmonaim, that Klal Yisrael is in a terrible state spiritually, very lowly state spiritually, and according to historical accounts, there were only 1,000 Jews left that were keeping mitzvahs. The worst probably we've ever been in the history of our nation. Even today, people lament our poor spiritual state and how few people are keeping mitzvahs. To think about 1,000 Yidden left, we had reached the bottom of the barrel, and there was an Isaurus by this Mishpacha, by the Chashmonoim, and they stirred Klal Yisrael to do tshuva and to rebel against the Greeks. Then we were liberated with the war effort, and we were matzliach, and we rededicated the Beis HaMikdash. So there's first a spiritual liberation, then a physical liberation. Same thing by Purim. The Jews participate in the Suda of Achashverosh, and they're sitting there, and even though the Gemara says he brought out the Kalim of the Beis HaMikdash, there was a tremendous Chilul Hashem. Jews are sitting at the Suda. After the Suda is over, Mordechai is me'orah them. They do tshuva, they fast, they realize that because of what they've done, they have a decree against them from Haman. Then once they do tshuva, then they're delivered from Haman. Spiritual liberation, then the physical liberation is only a result of what happens on a spiritual plane. So I think it's a very pertinent message. According to our tradition, Pesach is one of the times we wait for the Gula Shlema. There are people that stay up all night waiting for the Gula Shlema to take place on Pesach. And we see in the Chumash that we cannot have all of the brachas that we will have when we have the Gula Shlema. We cannot have all the Jews coming back to Eretz Yisrael, the rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash, the recognition by the Goyim that we are the chosen people, the recognition by the Goyim of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and that His Torah is emes, peace in the world, all the things we yearn for. We cannot have that until there's a spiritual awakening within Klal Yisrael. There first has to be a tshuva. That's what the Torah says. If we do tshuva, then we come back to our land, and the Gula will come, and the Rebbeinu Shalom will help us. But first there has to be an Isaurus from Klal Yisrael before we can be zoicha to the Gula Shlema. And so, Bezras Hashem, at this very, very holy time of year of Pesach, when we have a chance to liberate ourselves, not just be liberated from the yoke of non-Jewish oppressors, which was what happened in Mitzrayim, but to liberate ourselves on a spiritual plane from the influences of the Goyish world, which are so pervasive on every front. We're exposed to their ideology, we're exposed to their way of life, we're exposed to the way of dressing, we are inundated with non-Jewish culture. And this is a time of year that we can liberate ourselves from that, come back to the Rebbeinu Shalom, come back to the Torah. And in Mirz Hashem, if we can achieve that spiritual liberation, to come back to the Rebbeinu Shalom, come back to the way we're really supposed to be, we should be zoiche to see the physical liberation with the coming of the Mashiach.